Once, there was an introverted and quiet child, born into a wealthy and influential family. The child was a diligent student, following his dream to study medicine in London. There, he also fell in love and seemed destined for a peaceful life. But suddenly, one phone call changed his life forever. This is the story of Bashar al-Assad. How did a man who once had no interest in ruling become one of the world's most ruthless dictators? Let's start when the Assad family came to power in Syria. The year was 1970, and Hafez al-Assad led a successful coup. He ruled Syria firmly for decades, and in 1962, his first son was born, Bassel, the Golden Prince, who was raised to inherit the throne. All his life was leading to the point where he would inherit everything from his father. 3 years later, Hafez had a second son, Bashar. In contrast to the rest of the family, he was always quiet, shy, studious, and focused on a life of academia, far from the world of politics. Instead of attending political meetings or military briefings, Bashar was absorbed in his studies, first at the University of Damascus, and later as a young medical student in London. Bashar's life in London was that of a normal young man, trying to hide connections with the ruling family, getting ready for a different life. He enjoyed the freedom the city offered, making friends with Syrian intellectuals, and even falling in love. He met his future wife Asma, once described as a rose in the desert, and later on as the First Lady of Hell. In 1994, everything changed. A phone call shattered the life Bashar had been building. His older brother, Bassel, died in a tragic car accident. The young medical student now found himself in the grim reality of Syrian politics. There was no time to mourn or reflect on the life he had just lost. Duty called. The family needed him. He had to return to Syria to prepare for a role he had never wanted, let alone expected. The political landscape was not one of intellectual discourse, but one of survival, power struggles, and ruthless control. But it wasn't an immediate transformation. Bashar didn't suddenly become a dictator. Initially, he was a reluctant figurehead, a man in the shadow of his father, trying to find his place in this new world. In his early speeches, he spoke of modernization, political reforms, and a new direction for Syria. His government introduced some economic liberalization. He also made moves toward political reform, offering amnesties to political prisoners, easing restrictions on media, and calling for constitutional changes. Although there was hope for a brighter future for Syrians, the attempts at reform soon became overshadowed by a desire to preserve power. The shift began with the Lebanese assassination of former Prime Minister. Bashar's government was accused of being involved in the murder, and Syria found itself isolated on the global stage. To maintain control, Bashar leaned more towards the old ways of the regime and the military that his father had built. The true turning point came in 2011 with the outbreak of the Arab Spring. Protests erupted across the region, with people demanding more political freedoms, economic opportunities, and an end to authoritarian regimes. Bashar responded with force, thinking he could suppress the chaos as his father had done in the past. The government cracked down hard on the protesters, killing thousands in the early months of unrest. What was initially seen as a call for reform quickly escalated into a full-blown civil war. One of the cities suffering the most was Homs.
Every civilian house on this street has been hit. The top floor of the building I'm in has been hit, in fact, totally destroyed. There are no military targets here. There are rockets, shells, tank shells, anti-aircraft being fired in parallel lines into the city. The Syrian army is simply shelling a city of cold, starving civilians.
Marie Colvin, one of the most prominent war correspondents, described in her last interview in February 2012 the siege of Homs as the worst conflict she had ever witnessed. One day later, Colvin died in a rocket attack. The economy was in deep crisis, on the edge of collapse, but for Syria, it was not always the case. The country experienced economic growth in the 1970s due to rising oil prices and foreign aid, but growth stagnated at the end of the 1980s. A brief revival occurred once Bashar came to power, from 2000 to 2010, with GDP growing about 5% annually. But then, 2011 happened. The civil war devastated the economy, with an estimated $143 billion in damages by the conflict's first 3 years. Hyperinflation left Syrians in crisis, with GDP falling by more than 26% annually. By 2014, Syria was in a brutal conflict. Rebel groups, fueled by support from foreign powers, took control of large parts of the country. Bashar's forces fought back, retaking territory but at a tremendous cost in lives and infrastructure. Chemical weapons attacks on civilians raised international condemnation. In 2013, the town of Ghouta was hit with rockets containing the chemical nerve agent sarin, and estimates say over 1,000 people died. Since then, the country has been in chaos. Various factions control the territory, inflation is making life difficult, there are almost no services, and Syrians do not see a way out of their hard lives. Bashar al-Assad is still in power, but the war is far from over. At the end of 2024, everything changed. As of December 2024, the Assad grip on power in Syria is rapidly shrinking. The Islamist militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, with connections to extremist organizations like al-Qaeda, has launched a quick offensive that has overwhelmed key cities, including Aleppo, Homs, and finally Damascus. They reached the capital city in just a few days, with minimal resistance from Bashar al-Assad's regime. His allies, Russia and Iran, have left Assad vulnerable, without help. As of December 8, 2024, Assad is said to have escaped the country, leaving behind the 54-year-long legacy of blood, death, and destruction of the Assad family dictatorship. However, what will happen now in Syria only time can answer. Will the country be ruled by democracy or Islamic theocracy? Will there be another civil war, a fight for power, or will the country finally see brighter tomorrows?